Alright folks, since writing my history of Alexandria and timeline videos, there's been a question on my mind I've really wanted to explore. Does the Commonwealth arc actually work as a concept and ending in the Walking Dead television series and comic? Now, the characters and story beats between the two versions do generally remain the same, but the endings and overall purpose of the Commonwealth in relation to each respective story does differ quite a bit. And of course, when discussing the ending of the television series specifically, you kind of have to address the elephant in the room. This was not an ending at all. Allegedly, this was just the beginning. So although it does close out the original show's run, it is not the definitive finale for the franchise, unlike what we see in the comics, which is one of many factors as to why I believe this particular version didn't work. While the comics still suffered from its own problems surrounding the final stretch of issues, which we'll discuss shortly. This video will be comparing the two versions and how they work independently from each other, but I also want to discuss the Commonwealth as a concept itself, the idea behind it, and the question if it undermines the journey our survivors faced throughout the series so far. This will mostly just be my opinion, so if you don't agree with what I'm saying, that's totally okay. But if that is the case, I'd love to hear why after you finish watching in the comments down below. And with that, if you end up enjoying this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you hit that like button and drop a sub to see more content like this. Now, first things first. What is the Commonwealth and what was its purpose in the original comic run? Well, the Commonwealth in both versions of the story is a wide network of communities and townships located in Ohio with a central city acting as its capital. With a population of over 50,000 survivors across their coalition, the Commonwealth strongly resembles the Old World as it runs on a capitalist system with its residents assuming whatever career or position they held pre-apocalypse, resulting in an unfair class hierarchy that leaves the poor with no way to move up, while the rich get wealthier as its governor Pamela Milton sits at the top, running the city as an extension of her own ego. Equipped with everything a society could ever need to survive on its own, the Commonwealth in the comics specifically stood as the most advanced civilization in America, and by the time our survivors encounter them following the Whisperer War, they've long been established and functioning with little to no tribulations faced from what we hear, as their army was trained to take on herds and raiders in an extremely organized fashion. Now, if you haven't bowed out in fear of spoilers yet, now is your time because I'm not going to be holding back. The purpose of the Commonwealth arc in the comics is to establish Rick's legacy as a martyr to the apocalypse following his death at the hands of Sebastian Milton, inspiring the rest of the surviving population to build the world they want to live in. This is the crux of the arc, and everything else is really just a means to an end. However, leading up to his abrupt death, the story told within the Commonwealth itself was widely regarded as one of the weaker arcs in the series by fans, while it was debuting month to month, as we weren't aware this is what the story was building to. It was cool to see this many survivors in a setting like this, but it was hard to tell what direction the series was headed in. And in a way, it almost felt like a retread of what we experienced during the introduction of Alexandria in the sense of a return to the old world, just on a larger scale and with a different coat of paint. But following Rick's assassination in issues 191 and 192, after inspiring the Commonwealth civilians to rise up against their corrupt government and build a life better than the old world, the purpose of the arc had become clear. This was a huge shock to fans, and though the story leading up to this point was rather weak, it was an interesting direction to take as Carl would now be at the forefront of the series. Rick hadn't really spent that much time within the Commonwealth by this point, barely 7 issues to be exact, so although this plot point worked well as a concept in my opinion, it did somewhat feel rushed despite the Commonwealth arc dragging on. However, as most of you probably already know, the following issue would mark the sudden final installment of the comics, as Kirkman desired to have an ending that gave the same feeling of shock you had when turning a page to see your favorite character die, which saw a 20 to 25 year time jump that portrayed the events of the Commonwealth Revolution and Rick's death as a monumental turning point for America, as the Commonwealth over this time expanded across the entire eastern US, essentially rebuilding their world in Rick's image with Maggie as its elected president, as he had inspired the people to become something better. Again, this was just a means to get to this, which retroactively gave the arc more purpose, but didn't really make the actual plot lines surrounding the Commonwealth's internal politics any more interesting. It's clear the Commonwealth as a community was created to give the series a sudden drastic population boost in order to make Rick a public figure, so his influence on America would make more sense following his death, which the concept of Rick inspiring a large population does work as an ending to the series, but it's pretty obvious Kirkman had too much story for just one more compendium, but not enough for two. So some shortcuts were taken to get to that ending without sacrificing the compendium structure the series established so far. And this expedited journey in becoming a martyr is even felt by the characters within the story itself during the final issue, as Laura makes a comment on Rick receiving all the praise for something he was barely a part of. Again, bro only spent like 7 actual issues within the Commonwealth. He gave a few speeches and died, which I guess was enough to inspire those left behind for the next 3 decades. Now, I want you to hold on to what we've discussed here as we move into the TV show's Commonwealth arc. Obviously, without the inclusion of Rick, the fundamental purpose of the original Commonwealth's creation is no longer present. Going in, the show had the advantage of telling the audience the ending was coming, giving the writers more time to build to this revolution that was sure to change the world forever. But with the announcement of sequel spin-off shows coming following the finale, the threat of our main survivors dying was no longer present. So we went in knowing the climax of the Commonwealth arc was going to be extremely different. However, the show sort of shot itself in the foot before even reaching this point. As previously established, the purpose of the Commonwealth's introduction in the comics was to introduce a large population to serve Rick's story. But given the World Beyond spin-off had aired preceding this arc, the Commonwealth was deprived of this purpose, as we were already aware of a far larger and far more advanced civilization even closer in location to our coalition, which alone kind of makes the Commonwealth feel like the little brother of the Wasteland and far less important in the grand scheme of things. The comic, although containing its own problems, at the very least demonstrated how this is humanity's best shot at prospering, as Rick is even willing to sacrifice Dwight to keep order. But in the show, they just become another bully hell-bent on taking over the coalition, which I'll admit was an interesting watch, but wasn't exactly anything new, and kind of makes the Commonwealth officials seem even more naive, as they were actively expanding near Civic Republic territory without even knowing. Without Rick, or a big franchise-altering death at the end, the Commonwealth just becomes another obstacle in the way of our survivors' prosperity, which, again, isn't something we haven't already seen many times before. The show does the Commonwealth's initial introduction a bit better in my opinion, as the Whisperer War left the communities devastated and in need of help. But besides that, they did little to expand on what was already seen as a weak arc, with the exception of Lance becoming a much more prominent character. Although he's killed off prematurely, so that kind of falls apart towards the end too. So with all of that being said, what is the purpose of the Commonwealth in the show? Well, I suppose you could argue it's to give our survivors a more hopeful ending for the future, while exploring political issues rather than pursuing another physical conflict. Or, well, at least at the beginning. But more than anything, it's clear the Commonwealth was adapted simply because it was in the comic. There was no care put in for what the original purpose of its introduction was, and what the plotlines within were intended to lead to, which is proven clearly through the existence of the CRM altogether. It's kind of funny because the Commonwealth arc itself doesn't even really set up any of the spin-offs, at least as a direct result of what happens within. Maggie and Negan bury their conflict in the finale, and they aren't living anywhere near the Commonwealth in Dead City, while Daryl probably would have taken off eventually regardless once everything was in a state of peace. The Commonwealth arc in the show provides a fun watch for sure, but it delivers very little consequences going forward with the context of everything going on in the spin-offs, especially when compared to its influence in the comics. Sure, we haven't gone a 25-year time skip, so perhaps one day the Commonwealth in the show could expand to what we see in that final issue. But with the introduction of all these other societies, it appears the show is taking more of a new United States approach, making the Commonwealth just one of many civilized supercolonies across the wasteland, opposed to the primary superpower of the East we see in the comic. So, to bridge the gap between sections, the comics Commonwealth arc had a purpose in introducing a large population in order for Rick to influence the future of America in death, but lacked an exciting storyline leading up to that climax. While the show was cursed with having the two most important factors in its purpose taken away from it, as a larger and more advanced civilization was already out there, and Rick wasn't there to influence its future, with no character replacing the impact of his role, leaving the show with only the weaker aspects of the arc to adapt without the most exciting and consequential moment of its ending. But after comparing and contrasting the purpose and intent behind both versions, I can't help but feel the Commonwealth as a concept between both interpretations of the story is kind of unnecessary and undermines the journey our survivors have faced so far. Again, this is just my opinion, so I'm not saying this thought process is right, but I do invite you to convince me otherwise if you disagree. Starting out with the comic. Although I think it kind of goes against the hopeless feeling this world established early on, there is some value to the concept of an entire civilization being out there at the time of our survivors dealing with the most extreme cases of human horror. It's a weird contrast to think, while Dale's getting eaten by cannibals, somebody's on their porch drinking lemonade or watching a football game. However, I think issues really arise once you enter the Savior arc. To me, the idea of our survivors coming together to fight a war in order to build the life they want to live works so well when considering the natural evolution of an apocalypse story. But when you consider Eugene could have tinkered with a radio at any point and come into contact with Stephanie, it kind of makes it feel like what they fought for wasn't so special if something a billion times safer was only a few days' ride away. The war was fought because this place held the potential to restart society if everyone came together to work as one. It felt like if Rick and company failed their mission in all-out war, the future of humanity would have been rebuilt in Negan's vision. But that wasn't really true. A small collection of communities consisting of a few hundred people would have been under his rule, but society had already been re-established independent from anything going on there. Essentially, at any point, if Alexandria fell, a few days of riding west would have led to salvation, even if it was under the unfair class system. I know Ohio's a really big place, and it's possible they could have missed it, but with a population of 50,000, you kind of have to assume there's some form of signage or recruitment outposts in the surrounding states, given so many survivors discovered it. Rick's journey in the series was about becoming an influential figure to inspire the future, and although the events he faced throughout the series are what turned him into this monumental leader, the Commonwealth is never really directly affected by anything going on out east. Whether Negan or Rick won the war, the Commonwealth would have been there. So to say our survivors are responsible for rebuilding the world just as the comic attempts to portray just doesn't really feel true. They push the Commonwealth going forward to be something greater than it was for sure, but the Coalition had no influence on its establishment, survival, or prosperity up to that point, which to me takes away from all the progress our survivors bled for in the face of anarchy. So with that, how would I change this if I were in charge? And just to be clear, I'm not claiming to be a better writer or storyteller than Kirkman. This is simply how I, as a fan, would have personally liked the story to play out, not how it should have been written. Essentially, I would take out the community of the Commonwealth as we know it, but keep the aspects that led to that same ending without undermining the journey so far. How could that be done? Well, I'd still find a way to introduce a relatively large population similar to how they already did, but make Rick and our survivors responsible for restoring law and order instead of just changing what was already there. It would require a bit of remixing towards the end of the Whisperer arc, but perhaps throughout the war, we discover a good portion of the Whisperers are only there out of fear of Alpha and Beta, kind of like how Josh and his parents were at the end of the arc. And instead of just moving in to kill them, the Coalition accepts a large portion surrender. Of course, not the seriously disturbed ones, but the others just trying to make it by. Unlike the Saviors who surrendered because they lost and kind of remained trouble even after Negan, these surrendering Whisperers would do so out of genuine envy for what the Coalition has built. But with this influx of population, even without the loss of multiple communities, as we see in the show, Rick would look towards reclamation as their next project, which would consist of repopulating and reconstructing a small city, similar to that of the original Commonwealth within riding distance in order to expand and house these new coming defecting Whisperers, while simultaneously keeping them at arm's length as Rick attempts to evaluate if they could still be potential threats. Luckily, most communities made it through the conflict relatively unscathed, with the exception of the Hilltop, which was rebuilt within weeks anyway, leaving the Coalition in a much better position than what we see in the show, as most resources were spared. So with the Kingdom specializing in providing lumber, Oceanside and the Hilltop providing food once reconstructed, the Whisperer defectors providing manpower, akin to the Saviors assisting with the bridge but without the BS, and Alexandria providing defenses and fighters, the Coalition would essentially have everything they need to begin work on reconstructing a small city as easy as we see them rebuild the Hilltop. In my opinion, subtly moving from a small collection of communities to a city while maintaining the history of what led up to that point, instead of just finding it as is, would be a more natural evolution of the story. And to avoid scrapping all the ideas and characters the Commonwealth did introduce, perhaps some of these faces are already survivors within this city who have been struggling to bring everyone together under an established order. Kind of like how we've actually been seeing with Dead City. This way, you could still feature Pamela Milton as an ex-politician, but have her be motivated by greed and wanting to build the city into the Commonwealth we already know in order to gain back what she had in the old world. Perhaps she initially views the Coalition's arrival as a good thing, and intends to manipulate Rick to fulfill her vision, but descends into corruption as the broken city's current civilians begin looking towards Rick as an inspiring figure instead of her. You could, without a doubt, integrate some of these plot lines into this reimagined version. Sebastian would be a little tougher to fit in, but if you maintain Pamela's origins as an old world politician who is now desperate to re-establish the privilege she once had, Sebastian could still fit the exact role he played in the comic, but instead of Rick stripping away everything they have, he'd be stopping them from resuming the same unfair social structure that plagued the old world and put them on top to begin with, which would lead to that same assassination over the same purpose, but would leave Rick far more responsible for how the future turns out. Would this city still have a population of 50,000? Probably not, no. I'd imagine between the Coalition, newly recruited ex-Whisperers, and population already within the city by this point, they'd probably be working with only a few thousand people. But to me, the prospect of this evolving into something much larger due to Rick's death would be a more natural conclusion, especially if you explored a plotline about Eugene setting up recruitment beacons and restoring the radio towers. Is this version better? Well, no, again, I'm not a writer. But personally, I'd prefer if the influence of all the past arcs were felt throughout this final run. But as the story stands, no matter who wins All Out War or what came before throughout the series, the Commonwealth exists and prospers. How the revolution would have shaped out without Rick's presence is a mystery, but I can't imagine it would have been left in ruin. It would have changed for sure, and probably wouldn't have expanded to the extent we see in the final issue, but I think it would have continued to exist as a sanctuary safe from the dead regardless of its political structure. However, taking this rewrite into the show would be an entirely different beast as, again, other larger entities exist in this world that undermines the importance of the Commonwealth's large population in the comics. The arc in the show isn't made to be an ending to the franchise. It's supposed to be a stepping point that concludes the first phase of the series. And no matter what, with the wider universe direction the franchise took, the progress made by our coalition in rebuilding society was gonna be trumped by what was already out there whether the Commonwealth was adapted or not. So in this scenario within the context of the show's story, I think the concept of what the Commonwealth already was does work, but I think the attempt at adapting the story without the major beats that made it worth it in the first place failed in delivering a satisfying finale. So let's say the comic was still exactly how it is. How do we include the Commonwealth in a natural way that ends the main show, but sets up at least one of the spin-offs? Well, to be honest, I think I would scrap the whole class warfare story entirely, or at the very least, relegate those issues to 1 or 2 episodes. Personally, I just never thought it was that interesting or that deep when compared to many arcs that came before. And since we don't have Rick, and the focus itself isn't on the major population of the Commonwealth's impact on the world, I would simply use the Commonwealth as a tool to set up the CRM as a harsher threat that connects to the ones who live. Instead of corruption being the main theme, perhaps it was control, as the CRM could have been essentially holding the Commonwealth hostage. We were proposed with the idea of Designation 2 being a mysterious title given to criminals or defectors who are made to disappear apart from the regular prisoners, but unfortunately it was never actually elaborated on. So why not have this be the work of the CRM requiring the Commonwealth sacrifice civilians in order to not get bombed with chlorine gas as they further their agenda? This way, the Commonwealth would help rebuild Alexandria out of hopes they'd add to their forces by choice, instead of annexing and imprisoning them, leading to a revolution of independence from their oppressors. You can still keep the more political storyline, but give it purpose to setting up the future. And if you end it with a false truce, you could set up certain retaliation coming in the Ones Who Live. And by extension, have the Ones Who Live's finale revolve around saving the Commonwealth instead of Portland again, as Rick and Michonne discover their children are in the targeted city of the Army, giving even more reasoning to why they would double back in episode 5. This is just a rough draft of ideas on how you could do it, and of course, many character arcs would have to be changed entirely or in some cases scrapped. But considering expanding the franchise was always their plan, I believe the main focus of this final season should have been setting up these sequel shows. Or at the very least, the Ones Who Live, as it would be the easiest to directly connect in plot lines. So does the Commonwealth work as a final arc in The Walking Dead? Well, in the comic, I'd say the idea behind its purpose and the outcome works. Although the story surrounding the Commonwealth leading up to that point could have been executed far better. While in the adaptation's case, as presented, I think it delivers an okay plotline for a season, but a horrible ending for the series that fails to set up the expanding universe to come. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think. In your opinion, does the Commonwealth work as a final arc in either version of the Walking Dead story? Does one work better than the other? Do you think the concept itself undermines the journey that came before? Or does it work perfectly when considering what our survivors have been through? I'm extremely interested to hear what you guys think of everything we've discussed here today in the comments down below. But that is gonna do it for me today, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching.